My parents spent $720,000 on a new house for my brother. The same month they told me they could not spare a penny to save my daughter's life. I still remember the picture they posted that night. My mother stood on the porch holding a silver key. My father had one hand on Wesley's shoulder, proud enough to burst. Behind them was the kind of house they had always called a real future. At that exact moment, my 6-year-old daughter June was lying behind a glass wall in a pediatric cardiac unit, struggling to breathe while I held a hospital bill I could not pay. I thought that was the night my family ended. I did not know a stranger, standing near the children's memorial wall, had heard everything. I did not know he had once lost his own little girl because help came too late. And I never imagined that years later, the same family who abandoned June would come knocking at my door, begging for the mercy they had refused to give. Stay with me until the end, because what happened after that night changed every person in my family. If you believe in quiet justice, please subscribe to the channel before we continue. I was sitting outside the pediatric cardiac unit when that family photo appeared on my phone. I had not opened it on purpose. My thumb brushed the screen while I waited for the financial counselor, and suddenly there they were, smiling in front of Wesley's new home while my daughter was fighting for every breath a few doors away. 2 months earlier, my mother had bragged about the house over lunch. A good neighborhood, a smart investment, a proper place for Wesley to build his future. She said it like future was something only he deserved. I had sat across from her with June beside me, swallowing the old hurt because I was used to being the daughter who needed less. But that night, I did not need less. June needed help. That morning, June had been laughing in the car, counting yellow vehicles on the way to what should have been a routine checkup. By evening, her lips had turned pale, her breathing had changed, and doctors were using words that made my hands go numb. Complication, obstruction, immediate intervention. The financial counselor was kind, but her kindness did not change the number on the page. Insurance would cover part of the procedure, but not enough, and not fast enough. The surgical deposit had to be secured before morning. If I could not get the money, they would continue supportive care, but the full procedure might be delayed. Delayed was the word that terrified me most. For June, delayed did not mean waiting. It meant danger. I called my father first. Martin Brooks answered on the 4th ring, his voice cheerful and distracted. I could hear glasses clinking behind him. I explained the diagnosis, the deadline, and the way June's condition had worsened so quickly that even the doctors looked frightened. For a moment, my father said nothing. Then he sighed and told me they had already stretched themselves thin this month. I asked if he understood what I was saying. June might not get the procedure in time. His granddaughter might die. My father lowered his voice and told me not to use death as a way to manipulate people. Then he said my mother was better at these conversations and passed the phone to her. Celeste Brooks did not sound scared. She sounded irritated. She asked why I always waited until my problems became emergencies. I told her I had not waited. June had been monitored. The complication had come suddenly. The hospital needed money before morning. My mother cut me off. She said every family had problems. Wesley had a mortgage now. My father had retirement to think about. They could not empty their accounts every time my life became difficult. I almost laughed, but no sound came out. I had never asked them for anything like this before. I had raised June alone after her father disappeared. I worked double shifts. I bought secondhand clothes. I skipped meals when I had to. I was not asking my parents to rescue me from life. I was asking them to help keep a child alive. In the background, I heard Wesley ask if everything was okay. My mother covered the phone, but not well enough. I heard her say it was just me making another crisis about myself. Wesley laughed softly and said he hoped this was not about money again. I closed my eyes. When I opened them, June's doctor was speaking to another specialist at the nurse's station. Both of them glanced toward her room. I told my mother the amount. I told her it did not have to be a gift. I would sign a repayment agreement. I would give them my car title, my tax refund, anything. I only needed the money to reach the hospital before morning. My mother went quiet. Then she said the sentence that split my life in two. June is your responsibility. Wesley's house is about the future of this family. For a few seconds, I could not breathe. My daughter was lying in a hospital bed, struggling through every breath. My brother was standing in front of a new house, bought with family pride and family money. And somehow, in my mother's mind, the house mattered more. I asked her to repeat it. She did not. She told me I was emotional and needed to stop punishing everyone for my poor choices. Then my father's voice came back, sharper now, telling me not to ruin Wesley's night. The call ended. I kept the phone against my ear, even after the screen went dark. A nurse touched my shoulder and asked if I was all right. I wanted to say yes, because that was what I always said, but this time I could not force out the lie. I walked to the window of June's room. Her eyes were half open. The oxygen tube moved slightly with each weak breath. She saw me and tried to smile. It was tiny, more effort than expression, but it broke me more completely than anything my mother had said. I pressed my palm to the glass. June lifted 2 fingers under the blanket, our secret sign from bedtime. It meant I love you more than pancakes. I lifted 2 fingers back and smiled, because she needed to see me smile. My phone buzzed again. For one wild second, I thought my father might be calling back to say the money was coming, but it was only another notification under the family photo. A cousin wrote that Wesley deserved every blessing. Someone else called my parents wonderful. I deleted the photo from my screen, but not from my mind. The financial counselor returned just after 9. Her face told me the answer before she spoke. I had until early morning. If I secured the deposit, the team would proceed. If not, they would keep June stable as long as possible. I thanked her because I did not know what else to do. Then I stood near the vending machines and called everyone I could think of. Old coworkers, a former neighbor, a church office, a medical charity whose voicemail said applications took 3 to 5 business days. Every answer was either too small, too late, or wrapped in sympathy that changed nothing. Near midnight, I opened my banking app. The number on the screen looked almost insulting. I opened my contacts again and stopped at my mother's name. For 1 second, I thought about calling back. Maybe if I begged differently, I could make a grandmother remember she was a grandmother. Then I looked through the glass and saw June's tiny hand curled around the blanket. I had begged enough. I recorded one final voice message to my parents. My voice was low, raw, but steady. I told them this was the last time I would ask. Not for myself, for June. If they still chose Wesley's house over June's life, they should never call me their daughter again. I sent the message. No reply came. At 12:17 a.m., I blocked both their numbers. My hands trembled, but a strange calm settled over me. I had thought cutting ties would feel like rage. Instead, it felt like finally admitting that the family I kept trying to save had already abandoned me. I returned to June's door and sat beside it. I did not know how I would find the money, but I knew one thing. I would sell my car, sign any paper, and crawl through any open door before I let my daughter become the price of Wesley's new beginning. Down the hall, a man in a dark coat stood beside the children's memorial wall, holding a small bouquet of white flowers. I did not notice him. I did not see the way he had gone still during my last phone call, or the way his face changed when he heard June's name and the amount the hospital needed before morning. He looked from me to the glass room where June lay fighting to breathe. His hand tightened around the flowers. Then he turned and walked toward the hospital's social work office. I do not remember falling asleep, only the feeling of my head jerking forward when someone said my name. For one terrifying second, I thought a doctor had come to tell me June had gotten worse. I stood too quickly, my knees weak from exhaustion, and nearly dropped my phone. A woman in a navy cardigan stood in front of me with a folder pressed to her chest. I recognized her from earlier. She was one of the hospital's social workers, the kind of person who spoke softly because most families who met her were already close to breaking. Her eyes moved to June's room, then back to me. She asked if I was Elena Brooks. I said yes. She asked if I had a few minutes to speak in her office. My first thought was that they had found another form I had failed to sign, another policy I did not understand, another way to tell me I was still short. I told her, if this was about the deposit, I was trying. I just needed more time. Her face changed, not into pity, but into something gentler. She said a charitable medical fund had contacted the hospital and offered emergency assistance for June's procedure. The fund would not be paying me. It would not be putting money into my hands. If I agreed, the payment would go directly through the hospital's financial office toward the amount required to move forward. For a moment, I only stared at her. The words reached me, but I could not make them feel real. I asked who had contacted them. She said the donor wished to remain anonymous. I asked why anyone would do that. She looked down at the folder, then said some people helped because they knew what it felt like to arrive too late. I followed her into a small office with a desk, 2 chairs, and a box of tissues that looked like it had been refilled 100 times that week. She explained everything carefully. Because June was a minor, and because medical privacy rules mattered, no one outside the hospital could receive details about her care unless I gave written permission for limited financial coordination. The fund did not need her full medical history. It only needed enough documentation to verify that this was an urgent pediatric case and that payment would be made directly to the hospital. I signed where she showed me. My hand shook so badly that my name looked like it had been written by someone else. The social worker did not rush me. She told me I could ask questions. I had 1,000, but only one came out. I asked if this meant June could have the procedure. She said the surgical team was being notified. I covered my mouth with both hands. I had spent the last several hours trying not to collapse, trying not to let fear swallow me whole, and suddenly my body did not know what to do with relief. It came too fast. It hurt almost as much as panic. I bent forward in the chair and cried without sound because I was afraid if I made noise, someone would take the miracle back. The social worker waited. When I finally looked up, she pushed the tissue box closer and said the fund had a name. Iris Second Chance Fund. I repeated it softly. Iris. I did not know anyone named Iris. I did not know anyone who owed me a second chance. When I returned to June's room, the hallway no longer felt the same. Nothing had changed. Not really. The lights were still too bright. The machines still beeped. The nurses still moved with calm urgency. But somewhere behind all that, a door had opened. A nurse told me the team was preparing June for transfer within the unit. I could see movement around her bed now, purposeful movement, the kind that meant a decision had been made. I pressed my palm to the glass again. June's eyes were closed, but her fingers twitched under the blanket, as if she knew I was there. I whispered that help had come. My phone buzzed in my hand. For a second, I thought of my parents. I had blocked them, but my mind still moved toward them, like a bruise touched by accident. It was not them. It was a message from a former coworker, apologizing because she could only send $50. Another message came from the church office, saying someone would call me back in the morning. Hours earlier, those messages would have crushed me because they were kind and useless. Now they made me cry again because they were kind, and kindness had not come from where I expected it. A doctor came out just before 2 in the morning. He told me they were moving forward. There were still risks. There were always risks. But the delay I had feared was no longer the obstacle standing between June and her chance to live. I thanked him until my voice broke. He told me to thank the people who made it possible, then corrected himself gently and said I should try to rest. Rest felt impossible. My body was empty, but my mind was wide awake. I sat in the waiting area with my arms wrapped around June's pink sweater and stared at the doors where they had taken her. Every time they opened, my heart jumped. Every time a nurse walked past without stopping, I tried to convince myself that no news could still be good news. That was when I saw him again. At the far end of the hall, near the children's memorial wall, the man in the dark coat stood with his hands folded in front of him. The white flowers were gone. He was not looking at me at first. He was looking at the wall, at the small brass plaques with children's names engraved beneath painted stars. I had noticed that wall earlier and forced myself not to read it. A mother learns quickly which kinds of pain she cannot afford to look at while her own child is still fighting. But he looked at it as if he knew one of the names by heart. He turned slightly, and for a brief moment our eyes met. He did not smile. He did not approach me. He only gave a small nod, the kind strangers give in hospitals when words are too heavy for the space between them. I nodded back, because I had nothing else to give. Then he walked away. I did not know then that his name was Noah Ellis. I did not know that one of the stars on that wall belonged to his daughter. I did not know that Iris had been 6 when she died, the same age June was that night. I did not know that Noah had once sat in a hospital chair with a bill in his hands, calling people who promised to pray but could not pay, begging for more time while time ran out anyway. All I knew was that someone had stepped into the worst night of my life and done what my own parents would not do. At 4:36 inches the morning, a nurse came through the doors and called my name. I stood so fast the sweater fell from my lap. She told me June was out of the procedure. She was not safe yet, not completely, but she had made it through the first part. Her heart was responding. The doctors were cautiously hopeful. Cautiously hopeful. I had never loved 2 words more. I asked if I could see her. The nurse said only for a minute. June looked smaller than before, surrounded by tubes and monitors, but her color was better. Not good, not normal, but better. I stood beside her bed and touched the edge of her blanket because I was afraid to touch anything else. Her eyelids fluttered once. She did not wake up, but I leaned close anyway. I told her she had done so well. I told her I was right there. I told her nobody was going to trade her life for someone else's house. The words came out before I could stop them. A nurse looked at me, but she did not ask. Maybe she had heard worse things from mothers in rooms like that. Maybe she understood that sometimes grief needed a shape, and mine had the shape of a house with white columns and a red ribbon across the door. When I stepped back into the hallway, the sun had not risen yet. The world outside the windows was still dark, but the black had softened at the edges. I took out my phone and opened my blocked contacts. For 1 second, I hovered over my mother's name. Not because I wanted to unblock her, not because I wanted to tell her June had survived the first procedure. I only wanted to see if the pain still pulled me toward her. It did, but not enough. I put the phone away. By morning, my parents would wake up in Wesley's new house, or maybe in some guest room with fresh sheets and expensive curtains. They would drink coffee in a kitchen they had praised as the center of the family. They would probably tell themselves I had overreacted. They would say I was dramatic, ungrateful, impossible to help. But in that hospital, while June fought her way back toward life, I understood something they had taught me without meaning to. Blood could make people relatives. It could not make them family. Family was not the person holding a silver key in a photo while your child struggled to breathe. Family was the stranger who heard a mother breaking in a hallway and decided a little girl deserved one more chance. For the next 48 hours, I lived by the rhythm of machines. I learned the difference between a nurse walking quickly and a nurse rushing. I learned that doctors lowered their voices when they were worried, but smiled with their eyes when a child was doing better than expected. I learned that a mother could survive on vending machine crackers, cold coffee, and the sound of her child still breathing. June did not wake up right away. The doctors told me that was normal after everything her body had endured, but normal did not make it easy. I sat beside her bed, and watched the rise and fall of her chest, as if my own life depended on it. Her small hand rested outside the blanket, pale and warm under my fingers. Every few minutes, I whispered the same promise. I was there. I was not leaving. She was not alone. No one from my family came. That should not have surprised me. I had blocked my parents, and Wesley had never been the kind of brother who showed up where he was needed. Still, some foolish part of me kept waiting for someone to appear in the doorway with a guilty face and a late apology. No one did. The only people who came were nurses, doctors, and a social worker who checked on me with the quiet patience of someone who had seen too many families break in hospital chairs. On the second morning, June opened her eyes. It happened so gently that at first I thought I had imagined it. Her lashes moved, then her gaze found me. She looked confused, tired, and smaller than any child should look, but she was awake. I leaned close before she could try to speak. I told her not to talk. I told her she was safe. I told her she had scared me badly, and was never allowed to do that again. Her fingers moved under mine. Weakly, she lifted 2 fingers. I laughed and cried at the same time. Our secret sign. I love you more than pancakes. I lifted 2 fingers back, and for the first time since we entered that hospital, I let myself believe my daughter might come home. Later that day, the social worker came with more paperwork. She explained that the emergency payment from Iris' Second Chance Fund had been processed properly and sent directly to the hospital. There would still be bills. There would still be follow-up care, medication, appointments, and debt I could not yet understand. But the payment had removed the wall that had stood between June and the procedure. I asked again who had done it. She gave the same answer. The donor wished to remain anonymous. I wanted to be grateful, but gratitude felt too small for what I owed. Someone had looked at my daughter's life and decided it mattered. Someone had given June a chance when her own grandparents had weighed her against a house and chosen the house. I asked if I could write a thank you letter. The social worker said she could forward it to the fund, but she could not promise the donor would respond. I told her I did not need a response. I only needed the person to know. That night, while June slept, I sat by the window with a hospital pen and a sheet of paper from the nurse's station. I stared at the blank page for a long time. How do you thank someone for giving your child back to you? How do you write words large enough to hold a heartbeat? In the end, I wrote simply, "To the person who helped my daughter June, I do not know your name, and maybe I never will. But because of you, my child is still here." Last night, she opened her eyes. She lifted 2 fingers. Our little sign for love. You did not just pay a bill. You gave me another morning with my daughter. I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of that gift. I signed it with my name and folded it carefully. When I handed it to the social worker the next morning, I felt as if I were sending a message into the dark, hoping it reached the right soul. Years later, Noah told me he read that letter alone in his office after midnight. He said he had placed it beside a framed photo of Iris and sat there until the sun came up. At the time, I did not know any of that. I did not know that the man at the memorial wall had received my words. I did not know that the name Iris belonged to his little girl. I only knew the name of the fund had begun to live in my mind like a candle. June improved slowly. There were setbacks that made my heart stop, and small victories that made me cry in public without shame. The first time she drank a spoonful of water, I celebrated as if she had won a medal. The first time she asked for pancakes, I had to turn away so she would not see me fall apart. The doctor warned me that recovery would be long. He said we would need follow-up visits, careful monitoring, and a level of patience no parent ever feels ready to learn. I told him patience was fine. I could do patience. What I could not do was bury my child. On the 4th day, my mother found another way to reach me. It was an email. The subject line said I was being unfair. I read it standing beside June's bed while she slept. My mother wrote that emotions had gotten out of control. She said my father had been deeply hurt by my message. She said Wesley's celebration had been overshadowed by my accusations. She said families should not cut each other off over money. Over money. I stared at those two words until the screen blurred. It had never been over money. It was over the moment my parents heard June might die, and still chose to protect Wesley's comfort. It was over the fact that my mother could write an email about hurt feelings while my daughter lay in a hospital bed with stitches under her gown and monitors beside her pillow. I did not reply. Instead, I created a folder in my email and named it Brooks Family. I moved her message there, not because I wanted to save it for sentimental reasons, but because some quiet instinct told me that one day I might need proof of how easily they rewrote cruelty into misunderstanding. Wesley sent one message from a new number that evening. He said Mom was crying and Dad was furious. He said I needed to stop acting like I was the only person with problems. He said the house had nothing to do with June. I looked at my daughter's sleeping face and deleted the message without answering. The house had everything to do with June. Not because I wanted it. Not because I envied Wesley's porch or kitchen or perfect yard. The house mattered because it showed me exactly where my daughter stood in the family ranking. Below Wesley's comfort. Below my parents' pride. Below a red ribbon and a silver key. When June was finally moved out of the highest level of care, a nurse helped me wash her hair with a warm cloth. June was still weak, but she smiled when I told her she smelled like hospital soap and strawberry dreams. She asked if Grandma and Grandpa knew she was sick. I froze for half a second, then kept smoothing her hair. I told her they knew. She asked if they were coming. The question was so innocent that it hurt more than my mother's words. I wanted to lie. I wanted to protect her from the truth for one more day. But I had promised myself that if June survived, I would not raise her inside the same fog of excuses that had kept me loyal to people who hurt me. I told her I did not think they were coming right now, but that she had so many people helping her get better. June looked toward the machines, then back at me. She asked if the pancake person was helping. I smiled through the ache in my chest. She had heard me whispering pieces of the story when I thought she was asleep. She did not know about the house, or the phone call, or the words that had cut me loose from my parents. She only knew someone had helped. I told her yes. The pancake person was helping. After she fell asleep again, I took out my notebook and wrote the name Iris Second Chance Fund at the top of a clean page. Under it, I wrote every question I had. Who started it? Why they chose June? How I could thank them? Whether one day, when June was stronger and I was no longer drowning, I could help someone else the way they had helped us. That was the first time the thought came to me. It was small then, almost impossible. But it stayed. If my family had taught me what abandonment looked like, maybe this stranger had shown me what family was supposed to do. Maybe one day I could become the kind of person who did not look away from a desperate mother in a hallway. At the time, I thought June's survival was the miracle. I was wrong. The miracle was not only that my daughter lived, it was that the worst night of my life had quietly placed a new name on the path ahead of me. Iris. A name born from another father's grief. A name that would one day lead me to the truth about my family, the money they stole, and the man who had saved us, without asking for anything in return. 5 years passed before I could walk through a hospital hallway without feeling my knees weaken. June was 11 by then, taller, sharper, and far too observant for a child who still kept a small scar hidden beneath the collar of her shirts. Her doctors called her progress remarkable. I called it borrowed time that I had to learn how to deserve. Life after June's procedure was not peaceful right away. The bills did not vanish because she survived. Follow-up appointments filled our calendar. Insurance letters arrived in thick envelopes that made my stomach tighten before I opened them. Some nights, after June fell asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with a calculator, a notebook, and a cup of tea gone cold, moving numbers around as if rearranging them could make them smaller. Still, June was alive. She went back to school. She learned to ride a bike slowly, with a helmet too big for her head, and me walking close enough to catch her if she tipped. She made friends. She developed a strange love for drawing houses, though she always drew them with open doors. When I asked why, she shrugged and said houses looked mean when the doors were closed. I did not tell her how much that answer hurt. I kept my parents blocked for almost a year. Celeste sent emails at first, then birthday cards with no return address, then long messages through relatives about forgiveness and family unity. Martin sent nothing. Wesley sent one holiday photo of himself standing in front of the house with the caption, "Still thriving." I deleted it without replying, but I saved a screenshot in the Brooks family folder. By then, I had learned something about people who rewrite history. If they ever hurt you badly enough, keep records. I worked wherever I could, office shifts, weekend bookkeeping, late-night calls for a medical billing company that paid badly but taught me how to read the language that had once terrified me. Denial codes, appeal windows, provider networks, patient responsibility. Every ugly phrase became a tool in my hands. I could not change what had happened to June, but I could make sure no form ever frightened me into silence again. That was how I found the parent support group. It met twice a month in a community room attached to the hospital. The first time I went, I almost turned around before I reached the door. I did not want to sit in a circle and trade pain with strangers. I did not want anyone to look at me with that soft, careful expression people used when they knew part of your story was tragic. But June had just had another follow-up, and I had watched a young mother crying at the billing desk with the same empty look I once wore. Something in me would not let me go home. Inside the room, the chairs were arranged in a loose circle. There was coffee, stale cookies, and a table covered with pamphlets. I sat near the back, planning to stay silent. Then a man across the room asked a father beside him if he had filed for secondary assistance before the appeal deadline. His voice was calm, practical, never superior. He took out a pen and wrote something on the back of a flyer. I recognized him before I knew why. Dark coat, steady posture, tired eyes. The man from the memorial wall. I looked away quickly, embarrassed by the sudden force of memory. I had seen him only briefly that night, but the image had stayed with me. White flowers in his hand. His face turned toward the children's names. The small nod he gave me before disappearing down the hallway. The group leader introduced him as Noah Ellis. He helped families understand emergency grants, insurance appeals, and hospital financial assistance. No one said he was a donor. No one said he had saved my daughter. He was simply there, passing forms across a table, explaining deadlines, teaching frightened parents how not to drown in paperwork. After the meeting, I waited until most people left. I told him I thought I had seen him before. Noah studied my face for a moment. Not too long, just enough that I knew he remembered. He said hospitals had a way of making strangers familiar. I almost asked him if he had been there the night June was saved. The question rose in my throat and stayed there. Something about him told me he carried a locked room inside himself, and I had no right to force the door open. Instead, I told him my daughter had received help from Iris' Second Chance Fund years earlier. I said the name carefully, watching his expression. His hand tightened around the folder he was holding, but his voice remained even. He said Iris was a good name. That was all. Over the next few months, I saw Noah at meetings, fund workshops, and hospital resource days. He never pushed into my life. He never asked for personal details unless they were needed to solve a practical problem. When I had trouble appealing a denied follow-up test, he showed me which paragraph mattered. When another mother could not understand why her assistance application had stalled, he helped her call the right office. When a father broke down because he could not afford transportation to a specialist visit, Noah gave him 3 options without making him feel ashamed. That was what struck me first about him. He helped without taking ownership of people's gratitude. I had known people who used kindness like a leash. My mother could turn a ride to the grocery store into a debt that lasted years. Wesley could lend $20 and speak of it like an investment. Noah did the opposite. He gave information, made calls, opened doors, and stepped back before anyone could feel small. June liked him before I admitted I did. She met him after a family education session when she was carrying a notebook full of questions about fundraising for children with heart conditions. Noah answered every question seriously, even the one where she asked if a charity could accept pancake money from an 11-year-old. He told her pancake money was one of the strongest currencies in the world. June laughed, and something inside me loosened. I did not fall in love with Noah then. I need to be honest about that. I was not ready for love. I was still measuring safety by how quickly I could leave a room. I was still learning that not every offer came with a hook hidden inside it. Noah became a steady presence first, a chair beside mine at meetings, a name June trusted, a voice that explained hard things without making me feel foolish. Sometimes I caught him looking at the memorial wall when we passed it. He never lingered long, but his face changed. One evening, after a workshop ended late, I found him standing there alone. I almost walked away. Then I saw his fingers rest beneath one small brass star. Iris Ellis. The name hit me like a quiet bell. I stood a few steps behind him, suddenly understanding too much and not enough. Iris was not only the name of a fund. Iris had been a child. His child. Noah knew I was there before I spoke. He did not turn around at first. He only said she was 6. I said June was 6 that night too. He nodded. For a long moment, neither of us said anything. The hallway was almost empty. The lights dimmed for the evening, the air carrying that same clean hospital smell. I still hated. Then Noah told me Iris had needed a procedure they could not afford in time. He had begged, appealed, called everyone he knew, and by the time enough help came together, it was too late. He said it without drama, which somehow made it worse. His grief had been worn smooth by years of carrying it, but it was still there. I wanted to say I was sorry. The words felt too small, but I said them anyway. He accepted them with a nod. Then he looked at me and said he was glad June lived. That was the closest he came to telling me the truth. I did not ask more. Not that night. Maybe part of me already knew, and maybe part of me was afraid that if I named what he had done, it would change the balance between us. I did not want my gratitude to become a wall. I did not want his grief to become a debt I could never repay. So I stood beside him in silence, looking at Iris's star, and for the first time I understood that the miracle which saved June had not come from nowhere. It had come from another child's absence, another parent's wound, another family's unanswered prayer. On the drive home, June fell asleep in the back seat, with her sketchbook open on her lap. She had drawn 2 houses side by side. One had a closed door, the other had every window lit. When we got home, I taped that drawing to the refrigerator. I did not know yet that the Brooks family had a secret buried under Wesley's beautiful house. I did not know my grandmother had left a medical emergency trust meant to protect every grandchild, including June. I did not know Martin and Celeste had used my daughter's name to unlock money they never gave her. All I knew was that the life June and I were building had begun to include Noah Ellis, and for the first time in years, the word family did not feel like a wound. The first crack in Wesley's perfect life did not appear in a courtroom or a hospital. It appeared at a family funeral, beside a table of untouched sandwiches, when my great-aunt Ruth looked at me with cloudy eyes and asked why I had never used Eleanor's medical trust for June. I had not seen Aunt Ruth in years. She was my grandmother, Eleanor's younger sister, sharp when I was a child, softer now, but still the kind of woman who noticed what everyone else tried to hide. I had gone to the funeral of a distant cousin, because June asked if we could. She said hiding from the Brooks family forever made them too powerful in our heads. She was 11, too young to have that much wisdom, but she was right often enough that I had learned to listen. I did not expect my parents to be there. Of course they were. Martin stood near the front of the room accepting handshakes like he was hosting a business reception. Celeste wore black pearls and a grief face that looked practiced. Wesley arrived late with his wife and their little boy Lucas, driving a shining SUV that did not match the rumors I had heard about his missed payments and failing investments. My mother saw me across the room and froze for half a second. Then she lifted her chin and looked through me. That was fine. I had survived worse than her silence. June stayed close to my side. She was healthy enough now to look like any other child, unless you knew what to look for. The small pauses when she got tired. The way my eyes still followed her, breathing in crowded rooms. The way she touched the place under her collar when she felt anxious. Celeste looked at her once and then away, as if my daughter's survival embarrassed her. Wesley did not look embarrassed. He looked annoyed. His house had become his favorite subject years ago, but by then the shine had started to dull. I had heard from a cousin that he had refinanced twice. Another relative said Martin had quietly covered a business debt for him. Someone else said Celeste was trying to convince people Wesley was only going through a temporary setback. In the Brooks family, temporary was the word they used when a man failed, and everyone was expected to protect his pride. I tried not to care. I had built a life outside their approval. June had school, doctors who knew her history, friends who loved her, and a growing collection of drawings taped to our refrigerator. I had my work, the parent support group, and Noah's steady presence in our lives. I was not healed completely, but I was no longer waiting for my mother to become someone else. Then Aunt Ruth took my hand. She had been sitting near the window, wrapped in a dark shawl, watching the room more than speaking to it. When June went to help another child pick up dropped crayons, Aunt Ruth leaned close and said my grandmother would have been proud of the way I raised her. I thanked her. I thought that would be the end of it. Instead, Aunt Ruth frowned and asked if the trust helped much back then. I thought I had misheard. I asked what trust. Her eyes narrowed. She looked past me toward Martin and Celeste, then back at my face. The room seemed to lower its volume around us. She said Eleanor had set aside money years before she died, a medical emergency trust for the grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Not for weddings, not for houses, not for status. For serious illness, surgery, accidents, the things that could ruin a family overnight. Aunt Ruth said Eleanor had been strict about it because her own brother died young after treatment came too late. My body went cold. I told her no one had ever mentioned a trust to me. Aunt Ruth's hand tightened around mine. For the first time that day, her age seemed to fall away. She looked angry, not confused. She said Martin and Celeste were named as trustees after Eleanor died because they were supposed to be responsible. She said all direct descendants and their children were supposed to benefit if a real medical emergency happened. June had been 6. June had needed heart surgery before morning. June had been exactly the kind of child that trust was supposed to protect. Across the room, my mother laughed at something Wesley said. It was a small, polished laugh, the kind she used when she wanted people to think everything in her world was under control. I stared at her and felt the hospital hallway rise around me again. The glass wall, the bill in my lap, the word delayed. The phone going dead after she told me Wesley's house was about the future of the family. Aunt Ruth must have seen something change in my face because she lowered her voice. She said she had assumed I used the trust and simply never spoke about it because the subject was painful. Then she asked if I wanted her to send me the old paperwork she still had from Eleanor's estate meeting. I said yes before I could think of anything else. On the drive home, June asked why I was so quiet. I told her Aunt Ruth had mentioned something about Grandma Eleanor's estate that I needed to understand. June looked out the window for a while, then asked if it had to do with the night she got sick. I did not answer quickly enough. She nodded as if I had. That evening, after June went to bed, I called Noah. I tried to keep my voice steady, but he heard the break in it immediately. He did not interrupt while I told him what Aunt Ruth had said. When I finished, the line was silent for several seconds. Then Noah said I needed a lawyer who understood trusts, not just medical bills. He gave me the name Marin Vale. Marin's office was small, practical, and too neat to feel warm. She had silver hair cut to her jaw, and the kind of calm face that made me sit straighter without meaning to. I brought everything I had. My mother's email accusing me of being unfair. Wesley's message saying the house had nothing to do with June. Hospital records showing the timeline of June's emergency payment from Iris' Second Chance Fund. Screenshots of Wesley's new house post. Aunt Ruth scanned pages from the estate packet. Marin read more than she spoke. Every few minutes, she made a note on a yellow pad. She did not gasp. She did not call my parents monsters. Somehow that restraint made me trust her more. She explained that a trust like the one Aunt Ruth described would have documents, beneficiaries, trustees, and records of distributions. If Martin and Celeste had been trustees, they had duties. They could not simply treat the money like family savings. If money had been withdrawn for a medical purpose, there should be a paper trail. If money had been withdrawn using June's situation as justification and then sent elsewhere, that was not a family misunderstanding. That was something else. I asked what something else meant. Marin looked at me over her glasses and said we should find the records before choosing words. For 3 weeks, I lived in a strange state between fear and fury. Marin requested documents. Aunt Ruth found an old letter from Eleanor describing the trust's purpose. Noah helped me organize medical timelines, but he never pushed me toward revenge. He only asked what truth would give me that anger could not. I told him truth would give me the right to stop wondering whether I had imagined the cruelty. One Friday afternoon, Marin called and asked me to come in. Noah offered to drive me, but I went alone. I needed to be Elena Brooks, not someone being held upright by another person's strength. Marin had a folder waiting on her desk. This time, she did not start with careful explanations. She turned one page toward me and tapped a line with her pen. A large withdrawal had been made from Eleanor Brooks' Medical Emergency Trust 7 years earlier, during the same week June was admitted to the hospital. The memo attached to the trustee request mentioned emergency stabilization related to June Brooks, not full surgery, not hospital payment. Just enough vague language to make it look connected. My mouth went dry. Marin turned another page. The money had not gone to June's care. It had passed through a family account, then into funds used for Wesley's house purchase. For a long moment, I could not speak. I had thought my parents refused to save June because they were selfish. I had thought the house proved they chose Wesley over my daughter. I had been wrong. They had not only chosen the house, they had used my daughter's name to help pay for it. Marin did not speak while I stared at the page. I think she understood that the first minute after a truth like that does not belong to lawyers. It belongs to the person whose life has just been rearranged by it. My daughter's name was there in clean black letters. June Brooks. The same name I had whispered beside a hospital bed while she fought for every breath. The same name my mother had used when she told me June was my responsibility. The same name Martin and Celeste had apparently used to unlock money that was never sent to the hospital, never used for surgery, never used for the child whose emergency made the withdrawal possible. I touched the edge of the paper, but could not bring myself to touch the line where her name appeared. Marin said the withdrawal language was deliberately vague. It did not say the money had paid for June's procedure. It said the funds were needed for emergency family stabilization, connected to a qualifying medical event. That phrase sounded official enough to pass through a careless review, but soft enough to hide what had really happened. Martin and Celeste had not needed to convince the trust administrator that June's surgery was paid in full. They only needed to create the impression that a medical crisis had destabilized the family and required immediate support. I asked if that was legal. Marin leaned back slightly. She said the answer depended on the trust language, the supporting documents, and whether the trustees acted for the benefit of the proper beneficiary. Then she looked at me long enough for me to understand the careful lawyer language beneath her answer. No, it was not clean. She showed me the next set of records. The money had moved from the trust into an account controlled by my parents. 3 days later, a nearly identical amount appeared as part of the wire package for Wesley's house closing. There were small differences, fees, transfers, an amount held back, but the pattern was clear enough that even I could follow it. The trust had bled into the house. I felt sick. For years, I had imagined that night, in simple terms. My parents had money. They said no. A stranger said yes. That had been painful enough. But this was worse. This meant there had been a door inside my own family that could have opened for June, and my parents had not merely kept it shut. They had walked through it themselves, carrying her name like a stolen key. Marin slid another page toward me. It was an old letter from my grandmother Eleanor, copied from the estate file. Her language was formal in places, but I could hear the woman I remembered beneath it. She had written that no child in the family should lose care because adults were too proud, too slow, or too selfish to act. The trust was meant for serious illness, surgery, disability, accident recovery, and emergency care. It named children, grandchildren, and future great-grandchildren as possible beneficiaries. June had qualified. There was no question. My throat tightened. I remembered Grandma Eleanor's hands, thin and warm, guiding mine around a mixing bowl when I was little. She used to say a family's money was only as good as the mercy it could buy. I had not thought about that sentence in years. Now it felt like she was standing somewhere behind me, watching what her own son had done. Marin asked if I wanted to pause. I said no. If there was more, I wanted to see it. There was more. My parents had attached a physician's summary to the trustee request, but not the full hospital bill. The summary confirmed June's diagnosis and emergency status. It did not authorize the money to be sent to Wesley. It did not say the family had paid anything toward June's care. Someone had placed that summary next to my parents' request and allowed the trust to release funds under the impression that the money would help stabilize the situation around June. I asked how they got the summary. Marin said, "That was one of the important questions. I might have signed general paperwork during the hospital crisis without realizing how far it could be stretched, or someone in the family might have obtained a copy through another route. She did not want to accuse anyone without proof. But she said we would request the hospital records and look at every release form from that period." That was when Noah's name came into the room without being spoken. The payment from Ira's Second Chance Fund had saved June because it went directly through the hospital's financial office after I signed limited assistance paperwork. It left a clean trail. The fund verified the need, paid the hospital, and asked for nothing from me. My parents' trail looked different. It moved around the hospital instead of through it. It used June's crisis as a reason, then bypassed June entirely. Marin asked me if Noah would be willing to provide documentation of the fund's payment, if needed. I said yes, though I had not asked him yet. That evening, I drove to the hospital parking lot and sat there for 10 minutes before going inside. I knew Noah would be at the support group, helping a father appeal a denied medication claim. I could see him through the glass wall of the community room, bent over a stack of papers, his expression patient and focused. He looked up when I entered. Whatever he saw on my face made him excuse himself immediately. We walked to a quiet corner near the same memorial wall where I had first seen him. I told him what Marin found. Noah listened without interrupting. When I said my parents had used June's name to withdraw money, his jaw tightened. When I said that money had gone into Wesley's house, he closed his eyes for a second, as if the cruelty had weight, and he needed both hands to hold it. Then he asked what I needed. Not what I wanted to do to them, not how angry I was, what I needed. I told him Marin might need records from Ira's Second Chance Fund, proof of the payment, the date, the amount, the limited authorization I signed, anything showing that the fund paid because my own family did not. Noah nodded. He said he would have the records pulled. I thanked him, but the word felt small again, as it always did with him. He looked toward Iris's star on the wall and said he had kept every record from the fund's early days. Back then, He was afraid that if he missed one document, some child would pay for it. Then he looked back at me and said, "Sometimes paperwork was not cold. Sometimes it was the only witness that did not forget." I nearly cried then, not because I was weak, but because he understood exactly what I was afraid of. My parents would deny. Wesley would say he knew nothing. Celeste would call it confusion. Martin would say the family had handled things privately. But paper did not get embarrassed. Paper did not protect the golden sun. Paper did not ask a mother to be quiet so a house could keep shining. Over the next 2 weeks, the truth became harder and clearer. Marin obtained copies of the trust statements. Noah sent the fund's payment record. Aunt Ruth signed a sworn statement about Eleanor's intent and the family meeting after the estate was settled. I requested hospital records and found the limited authorization I had signed for the Iris Fund. It was narrow, careful, and dated after my parents refused me. There was no permission for Martin or Celeste to use June's medical emergency as a private financial excuse. Then Marin found the closing file for Wesley's house. There it was. A large family contribution applied to the purchase. Martin had signed one certification. Celeste had signed another. Wesley had signed the buyer acknowledgement, confirming the funds were a family gift and not a loan. The date matched the trust withdrawal almost perfectly. I stared at Wesley's signature longer than I stared at my parents'. For a long time, I had told myself maybe he did not know. Maybe he only benefited from their cruelty, without understanding the source. But his signature sat there beneath the gift letter, neat and comfortable. Even if he had not known every detail, he had accepted the money without asking why it appeared during the same week my child almost died. Noah was with me when I read that page. I had finally stopped pretending I could carry the whole thing alone. He sat across from me at my kitchen table while June did homework in her room, the house quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the scratch of my pen against paper. I told him I did not know what hurt more, that my parents did this, or that part of me had expected nothing better. Noah said betrayal did not hurt less, just because it made sense. That sentence stayed with me. Marin's advice was simple. Do not confront them yet. Do not call Celeste. Do not send Wesley a message in anger. Let the documents build a wall they could not climb over. If we moved too soon, they would destroy records, coach each other, and turn the family against me before I had proof strong enough to survive their lies. So I waited. Waiting was harder than rage. Rage wanted movement. Waiting asked for discipline. I went to work. I packed June's lunches. I attended support meetings. I sat beside Noah while he helped families who did not know that he had once saved mine. At night, after June fell asleep, I read my grandmother's letter again and again until one sentence felt carved into me. No child in this family should lose care because adults failed to act. My parents had failed to act when June needed them. Then they had acted for themselves. By the end of that month, Marin had enough to call it what it was. A likely breach of fiduciary duty. Possible fraud. Misappropriation of trust funds. Words that sounded clean and legal, but underneath them was the uglier truth. My parents had stolen from the emergency meant to save my daughter, and one day soon, they would have to explain why the house they called Wesley's future had been built on June's suffering. 2 years after Marin found the money trail, I believed I had learned how to wait, without letting anger poison everything around me. June was 13 then, old enough to understand more than I wanted her to, and still young enough to leave sticky notes on the refrigerator that said things like, "Buy syrup, pancakes matter." She was stronger than she had been at 6, but I never forgot the sound of her breathing behind that glass wall. Some memories do not fade. They simply become part of the way you listen to the world. By then, Iris' Second Chance Fund had changed too. Noah had never wanted his daughter's name to become a monument to grief. He wanted it to become a door. After I began volunteering, then working there part-time, then helping coordinate family assistance reviews, We renamed one of the emergency programs Iris and June Second Chance. I resisted at first. I told Noah that June was still alive, that Iris had paid the price for the fund to exist, and that I did not want anyone to think I was placing my daughter beside his loss, as if the two were equal. Noah said survival could honor loss without replacing it. June heard that and decided the matter before I could argue. She drew the first program logo herself, 2 small windows with lights on inside them. One for Iris, one for June. The work was hard, but it gave shape to what had almost destroyed me. We did not hand cash to families. We paid hospitals, pharmacies, transportation companies, and temporary housing providers directly. We verified medical need, insurance gaps, income, urgent deadlines, and hardship statements. I knew the rules mattered, because I knew what happened when adults treated money meant for children like something they could bend toward pride. Marin had advised patience with the Brooks case. We had the documents, but not yet the perfect moment. Civil claims were possible. Criminal referral was possible, but she wanted the record clean and the strategy careful. Martin and Celeste still had a reputation in the family as responsible, generous people. Wesley still lived in the house, though the house no longer looked as untouchable as it once had. There were liens now, late notices, refinancing attempts, small signs that the palace had cracks beneath the paint. I did not contact them. They did not contact me. For a while, silence became its own kind of border. Then the application arrived. I was reviewing urgent pediatric requests on a Thursday afternoon when I saw the last name Brooks. My hand stopped on the mouse. At first I thought it was a coincidence. Brooks was not rare. Then I opened the file and saw the child's name. Lucas Brooks, my brother's son. For a moment, the office disappeared. I was back at that funeral, watching Lucas drop crayons near the refreshment table while Wesley pretended not to see me. Lucas had been small then, round-cheeked and shy, hiding behind his mother's coat. In the application photo, he was older now, but his eyes were the same. Tired, frightened, too serious for a child. The request was for support related to a rare blood disorder, not a bone marrow match, not anything that required June's body or mine. Lucas had been accepted into a specialized treatment program in another state, but the family needed help with the upfront costs insurance would not cover quickly enough. Travel, temporary housing, medication copays, hospital coordination fees. The kind of expenses that could delay treatment even when a child technically had access to care. I read the medical summary twice. Then, I read the hardship statement. It was written in Celeste's polished voice. She said the Brooks family had always believed children came first. She said they had exhausted every available resource to protect Lucas. She said they were humble enough now to ask strangers for help, because no child should suffer while adults argued over money. No child should suffer while adults argued over money. I pushed my chair back so fast it struck the wall behind me. Noah looked up from across the office. He did not ask what was wrong. He only stood and came to my desk. I turned the screen toward him. He read the names first, then the medical request, then the paragraph Celeste had written. His face tightened, but his voice stayed calm. He asked if I wanted to step away from the case. I wanted to say yes. I wanted to close the file, walk outside, and breathe until the shaking stopped. But Lucas's face was still on the screen. He had not bought Wesley's house. He had not signed the gift letter. He had not told my mother to ignore my crisis. He was a child, and I knew better than anyone how cruel it was when adults made a child pay for their sins. I told Noah I would not punish Lucas. Then I told him I would not let his family lie either. We called Marin that afternoon. She listened as I explained the application, the hardship statement, the asset disclosures, and the timing. Wesley had listed the house, but he had described it as a family-gifted residence with heavy debt and no available equity. He had not disclosed the original source of the gift. He had not mentioned Eleanor Brooks' medical emergency trust. He had not mentioned June. Marin's answer was careful. She said the fund had every right to request complete financial disclosure before awarding assistance, especially when a family claimed hardship while holding major assets. We could ask for bank records, closing documents, gift letters, mortgage statements, and explanations of large transfers. The fund could not investigate like the police, but it could require honesty as a condition of aid. Then, she added the part that changed everything. If Wesley signed a new disclosure, claiming the house was a simple family gift, while we already had evidence that trust money had been diverted into it, we would have a fresh misrepresentation tied to a current financial request, not just old betrayal, a new lie. I sat very still. Marin told me not to ambush them informally. Everything had to be documented. The fund should send a standard supplemental request. I should recuse myself from the first-level review and let the board handle the medical urgency. If Lucas qualified, the fund could approve direct payments to providers, while separately requiring the adults to cooperate with financial review. That mattered. Lucas would not be used as a weapon. His treatment would not depend on my revenge. But the adults would finally have to answer questions under their own signatures. The next day, Noah sent the supplemental request in the fund's official language. It asked for updated mortgage statements, proof of income, bank records, documentation of family gifts, and a signed statement explaining the origin of funds used to acquire the primary residence. We gave them 48 hours, because Lucas's treatment timeline was urgent. Celeste called the office within 20 minutes. I did not answer. Noah did. I could hear only his side of the conversation. He said, "Yes, Mrs. Brooks. The request was standard for cases involving large assets." He said, "No. The fund did not provide unrestricted cash." He said, "Yes. Payments, if approved, would go directly to medical providers and verified vendors." He said the board would review the case quickly once the documents were received. Then he paused and looked at me. Celeste had asked who was on the review board. Noah said he could not discuss individual reviewers, but all conflicts would be handled appropriately. When he hung up, neither of us spoke for a few seconds. By evening, Wesley sent the documents. Not all of them. Enough to look cooperative. Enough to hope no one would push harder. He signed a statement, saying the house had been purchased with a gift from his parents, sourced from family savings. Family savings. I printed the page and placed it beside the trust withdrawal record, the gift letter, the closing file, and Grandma Eleanor's letter. The lie looked smaller on paper than it had in my imagination, but somehow more insulting. After everything, they still thought the truth could be buried under a neat phrase. Marin came to the fund office the next morning. She wore a gray suit and carried the same yellow pad she had used the day she first showed me the withdrawal. Noah set aside the conference room. The board approved emergency direct assistance for Lucas's immediate treatment expenses, with a note that no money would be released to the family personally. That decision brought me relief. Whatever came next, Lucas would not be abandoned the way June had been. Then Marin prepared the second letter. This one was not a routine request. It informed Wesley, Martin, and Celeste that discrepancies had been found between their current financial disclosure and records related to Eleanor Brooks' Medical Emergency Trust. It requested a formal meeting with counsel present. It warned that false statements in a charitable aid application could affect eligibility and might be referred for legal review. It also stated that Elena Brooks was a beneficiary representative with a potential civil claim concerning prior trust distributions. For the first time in 7 years, my name was not begging at the end of a phone line. My name was on the letterhead beside a lawyer's signature. The meeting was scheduled for Monday. That weekend, I told June only what she needed to know. Lucas was sick. The fund was helping him. The adults in the Brooks family had questions to answer about money from the past. June listened quietly, then asked if Lucas was scared. I said he probably was. She nodded, and said she hoped someone told him he was not alone. I had to turn away for a moment. On Monday morning, I stood in the conference room before they arrived. Noah was beside me. Marin was at the table with the files closed in front of her. Through the glass wall, I saw Wesley step out of the elevator first, pale and angry. Martin followed, stiff in his expensive coat. Celeste came last, her face arranged into the wounded expression she used when she wanted cruelty to look like dignity. Then she saw me. For 7 years, my mother had acted as if I were the daughter who disappeared because I was bitter. Now, she was standing outside a room where her grandson's aid application, her son's house, and my daughter's stolen emergency were all waiting on the same table. Her hand tightened around her purse. For the first time in my life, Celeste Brooks looked afraid. 2 years after Marin found the money trail, June was 13. She was stronger now, old enough to ask sharp questions, and young enough to still leave sticky notes on the refrigerator about pancakes. I had learned to live with anger without letting it run my life. I worked, took June to follow up appointments, helped Noah at the fund, and waited while Marin built a case strong enough that my parents could not bury it under family excuses. By then, Iris' Second Chance Fund had grown into something larger. One of its emergency programs was renamed Iris and June Second Chance, not because June's survival could ever equal Iris's loss, but because Noah said survival could honor grief without replacing it. We helped families with urgent pediatric expenses, but the rule was strict: no cash to parents. Payments went directly to hospitals, pharmacies, travel vendors, or verified housing. After what Martin and Celeste had done with money meant for a child, I believed rules were not cold. Rules protected the people adults were supposed to protect. I had not spoken to my parents in years. Wesley still lived in the house, though I had heard enough rumors to know the shine was cracking. Refinancing, late payments, business debt, quiet help from Martin. The house that had once been displayed like a trophy was starting to look more like a burden. I tried not to care. Then the application arrived. I was reviewing urgent pediatric requests on a Thursday afternoon when I saw the name Brooks. At first, I told myself it could be a coincidence. Then I opened the file and saw the child's name, Lucas Brooks, my brother's son. For a moment, the office disappeared. I remembered Lucas at the family funeral years earlier, small and shy, hiding behind his mother's coat. In the application photo, he was older, thinner, and far too tired for a child. The request was for support connected to a rare blood disorder. He had been accepted into a specialized treatment program in another state, but the family needed help with costs insurance would not cover fast enough. Travel, temporary housing, medication copays, and coordination fees. Not a transplant, not a match from June. Just the kind of expenses that could delay treatment while everyone pretended access existed on paper. I read the medical summary twice. Then I read the hardship statement. Celeste had written it in her polished voice. She said the Brooks family had always believed children came first. She said they had exhausted every resource to protect Lucas. She said no child should suffer while adults argued over money. I pushed my chair back so hard it hit the wall. Noah looked up from across the office. I turned the screen toward him. He read the names, the request, and the statement. His face tightened, but his voice stayed calm. He asked if I wanted to step away from the case. I wanted to. For 1 second, I wanted to close the file and never look at the Brooks name again. But Lucas's face was still on the screen. He had not bought Wesley's house. He had not signed the old gift letter. He had not laughed while my daughter was dying in a hospital room. Lucas was a child, and I knew exactly what it meant when adults made a child wait. I told Noah I would not punish Lucas. Then I said I would not let the adults lie either. We called Marin that afternoon. She listened while I explained the application, the asset disclosure, and Celeste's hardship statement. Wesley had listed the house, but he described it as a family-gifted residence with heavy debt and no available equity. He did not mention the Eleanor Brooks Medical Emergency Trust. He did not mention June. He did not mention that the original money trail led straight from my daughter's crisis to his front door. Marin said the fund had every right to require complete financial disclosure before approving aid, especially when a family claimed hardship while holding major assets. We could request mortgage records, gift letters, bank statements, and an explanation of the source of funds used to buy the home. The fund was not a police department, but honesty could be a condition of help. Then, Marin gave me the part that mattered most. If Wesley signed a current statement saying the house came from ordinary family savings while we already had evidence of diverted trust money, that would be a new lie in writing. Not only an old betrayal, a fresh misrepresentation. Marin told me not to handle the first review myself. The board would review Lucas's medical need, and if he qualified, the fund could approve direct payments to providers. Separately, we would require the adults to cooperate with the financial review. That line mattered to me. Lucas would not be abandoned. But Martin, Celeste, and Wesley would finally have to answer questions under their own signatures. The next day, Noah sent the supplemental request from the fund. It asked for updated mortgage statements, bank records, proof of income, gift letters, and a signed statement explaining the origin of the funds used to acquire the residence. Because Lucas's treatment timeline was urgent, they had 48 hours. Celeste called the office within 20 minutes. I did not answer. Noah did. I heard only his side. He said the request was standard for cases involving major assets. He said the fund did not provide unrestricted cash. He said any approved support would go directly to medical providers and verified vendors. Then he paused and looked at me. Celeste had asked who was on the review board. Noah said conflicts would be handled properly and ended the call. By evening, Wesley sent documents. Not everything, just enough to appear cooperative. The signed statement said the house had been purchased with a gift from his parents, sourced from family savings. Family savings. I printed the page and placed it beside the trust withdrawal record, the closing file, Grandma Eleanor's letter, and the old gift certification Wesley had signed years earlier. The lie looked small on paper, but that made it more insulting. After everything, they still thought a neat phrase could cover what they had done. Marin came to the fund office the next morning. The board approved emergency direct assistance for Lucas's immediate treatment expenses, with all payments made directly to providers. When I heard that, I could breathe again. Whatever happened to the adults, Lucas would not be left at the edge of care the way June had been. Then Marin prepared the second letter. It stated that discrepancies had been found between Wesley's current financial disclosure and records connected to Eleanor Brooks' Medical Emergency Trust. It requested a formal meeting with counsel present. It warned that false statements in a charitable aid application could affect eligibility and might be referred for legal review. It also stated that I was a beneficiary representative with a potential civil claim regarding prior trust distributions. For the first time in 7 years, my name was not at the end of a desperate voice message begging my parents to save my child. My name was on a legal letter. The meeting was scheduled for Monday. That weekend, I told June only what she needed to know. Lucas was sick. The fund was helping him. The adults in the Brooks family had questions to answer about money from the past. June listened quietly, then asked if Lucas was scared. I said he probably was. She said she hoped someone had told him he was not alone. I had to turn away for a moment, because my daughter had grown into the kind of person my parents had never been. On Monday morning, I stood in the conference room beside Noah while Marin arranged the files on the table. Through the glass wall, I saw Wesley step out of the elevator first, pale and angry. Martin followed, stiff in his expensive coat. Celeste came last, her face arranged into that wounded expression she used when she wanted cruelty to look like dignity. Then she saw me. For 7 years, my mother had acted as if I had disappeared because I was bitter. Now she stood outside a room where her grandson's aid application, her son's house, and my daughter's stolen emergency were waiting on the same table. Her hand tightened around her purse. For the first time in my life, Celeste Brooks looked afraid. Celeste stopped outside the conference room as if the glass wall had turned into a locked door. For a second, none of them moved. Wesley stared at me first, then at Noah, then at Marin's files on the table. Martin's face went tight in the way it always did, when he was trying to decide whether anger or dignity would serve him better. My mother recovered faster than both of them. She lifted her chin, smoothed the front of her coat, and walked in, as if she had been invited to a misunderstanding she intended to correct. "Elena," she said, using the soft voice she saved for witnesses. "Whatever this is, it is cruel to do it while Lucas is sick." I looked at her for a long moment. 7 years earlier, I had begged this woman to help June breathe through the night. Now she was standing in front of me, asking me not to be cruel. "Lucas's treatment support has already been approved for immediate direct payments," I said. "No money will go to you, Wesley, or Dad. But Lucas will not be left waiting because of what adults did." Wesley's shoulders dropped with visible relief. Celeste did not look relieved. She looked inconvenienced, because the sentence took away the weapon she had planned to use against me. Marin invited them to sit. She did not raise her voice. She did not threaten. That was what made her so effective. Her calm made every lie in the room sound louder before anyone spoke it. She explained that Iris and June Second Chance had reviewed Lucas's medical needs separately from the family's financial disclosures. Lucas qualified for urgent assistance. However, Wesley's signed statement about the house raised serious concerns. He had claimed the home was purchased with a gift from his parents, sourced from family savings. Marin placed a copy of his statement on the table, then placed another document beside it, the old closing file for the house. Wesley glanced down, then looked away too quickly. Marin turned the next page toward him. It was the gift certification he had signed years ago, confirming that the funds used toward the purchase were a family gift, not a loan. He shifted in his chair. Celeste put one hand on his arm. Martin cleared his throat and said families helped each other all the time. He said it was not a crime for parents to help their son buy a house. Marin nodded. "That is true. The question is not whether parents may help an adult child. The question is whether trustees may divert money from a medical emergency trust and conceal the purpose of that transfer." The room went still. Celeste's eyes flicked to the folder closest to Marin's hand. Wesley looked confused, or at least he wanted to look confused. Martin's jaw tightened. Marin opened the next file. She placed Grandma Eleanor's letter on the table. I saw my grandmother's name at the top and felt the familiar ache in my chest. Eleanor Brooks had written that no child in the family should lose care because adults were too proud, too slow, or too selfish to act. The trust was for serious illness, surgery, accident recovery, and emergency care. Children, grandchildren, and future great-grandchildren were all possible beneficiaries. June had been one of them. Marin placed the trust withdrawal record beside the letter. The date sat there like a blade. It was the same week June was admitted to the hospital. The memo mentioned emergency family stabilization connected to June Brooks. My mother stared at the page but did not touch it. I watched her face carefully. There was surprise there, but not the kind that comes from learning something for the first time. It was the kind that comes when something buried rises to the surface before you are ready. Wesley leaned forward. "What is that supposed to mean?" No one answered him immediately. Marin placed the bank transfer record next to the withdrawal. Then she placed the house closing funds summary beside that. The path was clear enough for anyone at the table to follow. Money left the medical trust under language tied to June's emergency. It passed through a family account. Then it appeared in the wire package for Wesley's house. Wesley's face changed. For the first time since he walked in, he looked less angry than afraid. "That is not possible," he said. I looked at him. I said the same thing when I first saw it. Celeste finally spoke. Her voice was thin. She said the money had been used to stabilize the family during a difficult time. She said June's crisis had affected everyone. She said the trust terms were complicated, And if there had been a mistake, it was an administrative mistake, not theft. Marin wrote something on her pad. Then you will have no issue explaining why none of the withdrawn funds were paid toward June's medical care. Martin snapped. That was when Noah spoke. Until then, he had sat quietly beside me, his hands folded on the table. He had not come to perform anger. He had come because the truth needed a witness. No stranger was poisoned against you, he said. I was at the hospital that night. Celeste turned toward him. And who are you? Noah held her gaze. My name is Noah Ellis. My daughter Iris died because help came too late. That night, I heard Elena begging you to help June. I heard enough to know the hospital needed urgent payment. My fund contacted the hospital social worker. Elena signed the proper financial assistance release, and the payment went directly to the hospital. That is why June's procedure moved forward. Celeste's lips parted, but nothing came out. Noah continued, still calm. You had a trust meant for children like June. You did not use it for her care. You let a stranger do what her grandparents would not. The sentence landed harder than shouting could have. Wesley looked at my parents. You told me Elena was exaggerating. You told me the hospital worked it out. I almost laughed at that. Not because it was funny, but because even now, Wesley seemed more wounded by the idea that he had been misled than by the fact that my child had nearly died. I said, the hospital worked it out because Noah's fund paid the deposit, not because you helped, not because Mom and Dad helped, and not because that trust helped the child it was supposed to protect. Wesley pushed his chair back a few inches. I did not know where the money came from. Marin slid his signed gift acknowledgement toward him. You signed that you received a family gift for the purchase. Whether you knew the entire source then is a question for later. But last financial disclosure, claiming the house came from family savings, that statement was made after you were asked to provide complete financial information for a charitable aid application. Wesley swallowed. Celeste tried again, this time with tears rising in her eyes. She looked at me as if the room were empty except for us. Elena, please. Your nephew is sick. Are you really going to destroy your brother's life over old paperwork? I thought of June behind the glass. I thought of her 2 fingers under the blanket. I thought of my mother telling me Wesley's house was the future of the family while my daughter waited for a chance to live. Lucas is sick, I said. That is why the fund is helping him. But you do not get to hide behind a child again. Martin stood so abruptly his chair scraped the floor. He said this meeting was over. Marin did not move. She simply told him he was free to leave, but the fund would preserve all records related to the application, and I had the right to pursue a civil claim as a beneficiary representative. She also said that if the documents suggested fraud or misappropriation by trustees, the matter could be referred for legal review beyond this room. Martin sat back down. That was the moment I knew the power had shifted. Not because I was louder, not because I had money, because the truth was finally sitting at the table with us, page after page, and my parents could not order it to be quiet. Wesley picked up the trust withdrawal record. His hand shook slightly. He looked at the date, then at the house closing summary, then at my parents. The house, he said slowly. You used June's emergency money for my house? Celeste began to cry then, but they were not the tears of a grandmother grieving what she had done to a child. They were the tears of a woman watching control slip through her fingers. Martin said nothing. Wesley looked at me, and for once there was no smirk, no superiority, no golden sun standing safely behind our mother's praise. There was only a man staring at the foundation of his life, and seeing what it had been built on. I did not comfort him. Marin closed the file and said the next step was simple. They could cooperate with a full accounting, correct the false disclosure, and begin discussions about repayment to the trust. Or they could refuse, and the documents would go where documents like that were meant to go. My mother whispered my name. I stood. No, you do not get to say my name like that now. 7 years ago, I begged you to remember June was your granddaughter. Today I am only asking you to remember she was a beneficiary." Then I walked out of the room before my anger could become anything less than clean. Marin gave them 7 days to respond. Not 7 days to cry. Not 7 days to call relatives and turn themselves into victims. Not 7 days to rewrite the story until it sounded softer. 7 days to decide whether they would cooperate with a full accounting and repayment plan, or force the documents into court. For the first time in my life, the Brooks family was quiet. Celeste did not send me long emails about forgiveness. Martin did not call me dramatic through a relative. Wesley did not text that I was ruining everyone's life. Their silence felt different from the silence after June's surgery. Back then, they had been silent because they believed my pain did not matter. Now they were silent because every word could become evidence. Lucas's treatment support moved forward during that week. The fund paid the approved costs directly to the hospital, the travel office, and the temporary housing provider near the treatment center. No money went into Wesley's hands. No check passed through Celeste's purse. Lucas got what he needed without giving the adults another chance to touch money meant for a child. That mattered to me more than anyone understood. June asked about Lucas every night. She did not ask about Wesley, or Martin, or Celeste. She asked if Lucas had a room near the hospital. She asked if he had books. She asked if anyone had told him that being scared did not make him weak. I answered what I could, and protected her from the rest. I had learned that truth mattered, but children did not need to carry every ugly detail adults created. On the 5th day, Marin called and said Martin's attorney had contacted her. They wanted to discuss settlement. The word should have felt like victory. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table and stared at June's old drawing on the refrigerator, the one with 2 houses side by side, one dark, one full of light. A settlement did not erase the night I had begged. It did not erase June's pale lips, or the glass wall, or my mother's voice telling me Wesley's house was the future of the family. It only meant the truth had become expensive enough that they were finally willing to respect it. The first offer was insulting. Martin and Celeste claimed the trust distribution had been a misunderstanding. They offered a partial repayment over 10 years, with no admission of wrongdoing and strict confidentiality. Marin read the offer aloud in her office, then looked at me over her glasses. I said no before she could ask. Marin nodded as if she had expected that. She sent back our terms. Full accounting, corrected records, repayment to Eleanor Brooks Medical Emergency Trust, written acknowledgement that the distribution had not been used for June's medical care, legal fees, a binding agreement that any future medical trust request involving family members would require independent trustee review. If they refused, we would file the civil action and reserve the right to refer the documents for further investigation. The second offer came back better, but still wrapped in pride. They wanted the trust repaid, but quietly. They wanted Wesley removed from any language suggesting he had benefited from misused funds. They wanted Celeste's name protected because she had health concerns. They wanted Martin described as acting under financial pressure. Marin looked at me. Noah sat beside me, silent. I thought of all the times my family had asked me to make their cruelty easier to swallow. Be reasonable, be quiet. Do not embarrass us. Do not ruin Wesley's night. Do not punish everyone for your poor choices. I told Marin I did not need public humiliation for its own sake. I did not need their names shouted from rooftops. But I would not sign a lie to protect them from the truth. The final settlement took 3 weeks. By then, Wesley's house had become the center of everything. There was no clean way for them to repay the trust without touching it. Wesley had refinanced too many times. Martin's accounts were not as strong as he pretended. Celeste had spent years maintaining a life that looked better from the street than it did on paper. The house was their biggest asset, their trophy, their proof that Wesley had been worth every sacrifice. Now it had to be sold. No one forced them with a dramatic court order. That would have been the story my mother wanted to tell later. that I had marched in and stolen her son's home. The truth was colder. Their lawyer advised them that selling the house was the fastest way to repay the trust, avoid a public lawsuit, and reduce the risk of the documents being handed to people with more power than Marin. So they chose it. They signed the settlement in a conference room, with no family photos on the wall. Martin looked smaller than I remembered. Wesley looked angry, but not at me. He kept staring at his father, as if trying to understand how a gift had become a chain around his neck. Celeste wore the same pearls from the house photo. I wondered if she had chosen them on purpose, or if she had forgotten how they would look to me. When it was time for her to sign, her hand hovered over the page. She looked at me and whispered that I was taking everything. I answered quietly, because I wanted every word to stay clean. You took from June 1st. I am only making you put it back. Her face twisted, but she signed. The house went on the market 2 weeks later. I did not go see it. I did not need to stand in front of the white columns or watch strangers walk through Wesley's kitchen. The listing photos were enough. There was the porch from the night June nearly died. There was the doorway where my mother held the silver key. There were the wide windows, the polished floors, the rooms my parents had called Wesley's future. This time, the photos did not hurt the same way. They looked like evidence. The family found out slowly, then all at once. Aunt Ruth called me first. She did not ask for details. She only said Eleanor would have wanted the money returned. A cousin sent me a message apologizing for commenting on the original house post years earlier. Another relative asked if it was true that the trust had existed all along. I did not answer most of them. I had spent enough of my life explaining pain to people who only believed paper. Celeste tried one last time after the sale agreement was signed. She came to the fund office without an appointment. Noah was in a meeting. Marin was not there. I saw my mother through the glass door before she saw me. For a moment, she looked old. Not harmless. Not innocent. Just old. I stepped into the hallway, because I would not let her bring that energy into a place built to help children. She said she wanted to talk mother to daughter. I told her that mother to daughter had ended the night she chose Wesley's house over June's life. She flinched, then recovered. She said I had no idea how hard it had been to keep the family together. She said Wesley was fragile back then. She said my father believed the house would stabilize him. She said they always intended to help me later. Later. I almost smiled. June did not have later, I said. Celeste's eyes filled with tears. This time I could not tell whether they were real. Maybe they were. Maybe she did regret something now that regret had a price. But I had learned not to confuse tears with accountability. She asked if I hated her. The honest answer was complicated, and I was tired of giving complicated answers to people who wanted simple forgiveness. So I told her the truth I could live with. I do not hate you enough to become you. She looked as if I had slapped her. I continued. Lucas is being helped. Not because of you, not because of Wesley, because he is a child, and children should not pay for adult sins. But you and Dad and Wesley will pay for yours. She left without another word. Lucas began treatment the following month. Noah received updates through the proper channels. The early response was cautious but hopeful. When I told June, she cried in the quiet way she had, with one hand over her mouth. Then she asked if she could send him a card. I said yes. She wrote only a few lines. She told him hospitals were scary, but nurses knew where the good popsicles were. She told him to count lights on the ceiling if he could not sleep. She did not sign it as his cousin, because she barely knew him. She signed it from June, someone who had been scared too. That card mattered more to me than the settlement. It proved my parents had failed to pass their cruelty down. The day the house officially sold, I expected to feel joy. I did not. What I felt was release. The money moved into the trust under legal supervision. Marin confirmed the repayment. The records were corrected. Martin and Celeste were removed from trustee control. An independent trustee was appointed. Eleanor's words would finally mean what she meant them to mean. No child in the family should lose care because adults failed to act. That night, Noah came over with takeout. June fell asleep on the couch after insisting she was not tired. We covered her with a blanket and sat at the kitchen table under the soft light above the stove. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then Noah said Iris would have liked June. I looked at him and felt something in my chest loosen. I said June would have loved her. He reached across the table, not quickly, not dramatically, just enough to let me choose. I placed my hand in his. His fingers closed around mine with the kind of care that did not ask for anything it had not been given. The house that almost cost my daughter her life was gone. But, in its place, something else had begun to stand. Lucas did not recover quickly, but he recovered honestly. That mattered to me. There were no miracle headlines, no perfect ending wrapped in one hospital update. There were long drives, blood tests, medication changes, bills sent to the right places, and frightened parents learning that a child's treatment could not be handled like a family secret. The fund continued paying approved expenses directly to the providers. Wesley never touched $1. Celeste never got to turn Lucas's illness into another performance of sacrifice. Martin never got to stand in front of relatives and pretend he had fixed everything. The early reports were cautious. Then they became hopeful. Then one afternoon, Noah received an update that Lucas had responded better than expected to the first phase of treatment. I read the message twice before telling June. She was doing homework at the kitchen table, one sock half off, pencil tucked behind her ear. When I said Lucas was improving, she sat very still for a moment, then nodded as if she had been holding her breath for weeks. "I'm glad," she said. There was no bitterness in her voice, no triumph, no question about whether he deserved it. She was simply glad a child was getting better. I looked at my daughter and realized that even after everything my family had done, they had not managed to make her cruel. That was the victory I had wanted most. The settlement changed the Brooks family more than any argument ever could. The house was gone. Martin and Celeste moved into a smaller place outside the neighborhood they had spent years trying to impress. Wesley and his wife rented a townhouse near Lucas's treatment center. The family stories changed too. At first, people whispered that I had forced my brother to sell his home. Then Aunt Ruth began showing relatives copies of Eleanor's letter. Marin's corrected trust records followed. After that, the whispers became quieter, because truth has a way of making gossip feel cheap. Celeste sent one handwritten letter, 3 months after the sale. I knew her handwriting before I opened the envelope. For a long time, I just held it over the trash can. Then I read it once. She said she had made mistakes. She said she had been afraid of losing Wesley. She said she had convinced herself that June would somehow be fine. She did not ask directly for forgiveness, but every line leaned toward it. I folded the letter and placed it in the Brooks family folder. I did not answer. That was not revenge, that was peace. I had spent too many years believing every pain needed a response. Some things only needed a boundary. Martin never wrote. Wesley sent one short message through Marin, thanking the fund for helping Lucas. It was stiff, probably reviewed by his lawyer, but I accepted it for what it was. Not redemption, not brotherhood, just a small sign that the golden son had finally learned the world did not exist to protect his comfort. Spring came slowly that year. June turned 14 with a stack of pancakes taller than her water glass and a candle stuck into the top one because she said cake was too predictable. Noah came over early with flowers and a book about medical charities written for young readers. June rolled her eyes and said only he would bring homework to a birthday breakfast, but she hugged him longer than usual. After breakfast, she asked if we could go to the hospital. I thought she meant for a follow-up appointment, and my heart jumped before I could stop it. She saw my face and touched my hand. "Not for me," she said. "For Iris." Noah looked down at his coffee. We went that afternoon. The children's memorial wall was in the same quiet hallway where I had first seen him standing with white flowers. I had avoided that wall for years, because I thought grief might be contagious, as if reading those names would invite the worst back into my life. Now I stood before it with my daughter alive beside me, and the man who had lost his child on my other side. Iris Ellis, 6 years old. June held a small envelope in both hands. Inside was a drawing of 2 girls sitting on a porch with every door open behind them. She had written one sentence at the bottom: "Thank you for helping your dad help me." Noah read it and covered his mouth. For a moment, he looked like the man I had seen 7 years earlier, broken in a place no one could reach. Then June placed the drawing beneath Iris's star, and he let out a breath that sounded as if he had been holding it since the day his daughter died. He knelt beside June and thanked her. June said she would have liked pancakes. Noah laughed through tears. She would have loved them. I stood a few steps away, giving them the space grief deserved. But Noah reached back for my hand without looking, and I took it. That was how we stood there for a long time, not replacing the child he lost, not pretending the past had become beautiful, just letting love exist beside grief without asking one to defeat the other. A month later, Iris and June's Second Chance held its first community dinner. It was not grand. We used a church hall, folding chairs, donated flowers, and a banner June had helped design. Families came with children in wheelchairs, children with scars, children with medication schedules taped inside backpacks. Some parents looked exhausted, some looked newly hopeful. I recognized both expressions. I gave a short speech. I did not name my parents. I did not need to. I spoke about the night June almost lost her chance because money moved slower than illness. I spoke about a stranger who refused to look away. I spoke about Eleanor's words, that no child should lose care because adults failed to act. Then I said the fund existed for families who were not out of love, only out of time. When I stepped down, Noah was waiting near the side of the stage. He looked nervous, which was unusual for him. June stood beside him with a smile she was trying badly to hide. Noah did not make a spectacle. He knew me too well for that. He simply took my hands and said that for years he had believed the best part of his life had ended with Iris. Then June survived. And somehow Iris's name became a door instead of only a wound. He said I had taught him that healing did not mean forgetting, and that love could be gentle without being weak. Then he asked if I would build the rest of my life with him. The room went quiet around us, but I heard June whisper, "Say yes, Mom." I looked at Noah, at the man who had once saved my daughter without asking to be known, at the father who turned his worst loss into mercy for strangers, at the steady hand that had never tried to own my gratitude. I thought of the girl I had been in that hospital hallway, shaking with a bill in her lap, believing no one was coming. Someone had come, and he had stayed. I said yes. June cried first. Then I did. Noah held us both, and for the first time in years, I did not feel like I was standing outside a family, looking through glass at something I had never been allowed to enter. I was inside one, not because of blood, not because of obligation, because love had chosen to show up, again and again, until the door stayed open. Later that night, after the hall emptied and the last chairs were stacked, June found me looking at the banner. Iris and June's Second Chance. 2 names, 2 children, one lost and one living, both changing lives in ways neither of them could have understood. "Do you think Grandma Celeste will ever really be sorry?" June asked. I thought about the letter in the folder. The house sold, the trust restored, the years no apology could return. "Maybe," I said. "But we do not have to wait for that to be free." June nodded. Then she slipped her hand into mine the way she had when she was little. The Brooks house with the white columns was gone. The silver key meant nothing now. The future my parents tried to buy for Wesley had collapsed under the truth they stole to build it. But June was alive. Lucas was healing. Noah was beside me. Iris's name was helping children breathe, travel, recover, and come home. In the end, My parents taught me what family was not. It was not the people smiling in front of a house while a child waited for care. It was not the ones who called cruelty responsibility and theft a misunderstanding. It was not blood used as a chain. Family was the person who heard a mother breaking in a hallway and refused to walk away. Family was a daughter who chose kindness without becoming weak. Family was a lost child, whose name became a second chance for others. And for the first time in my life, I stopped knocking on closed doors. I built a home with open ones.